To illustrate the workings of the banking system, we need to examine a commercial bank's balance sheet. The balance sheet of a bank is a statement of assets, things owned by the bank or owed to the bank, and claims on those assets called liabilities. A bank balance sheet summarizes the financial position of the bank at a certain time. Every balance sheet must be balanced. This means that the value of assets must equal the value of liabilities. Before looking at a specific balance sheet, there are a couple need-to-know terms. Number one, asset. An asset is anything that is owned by the bank. The three assets that you will come across over and over again are reserves, securities, which is also a bond, and loans. These are assets because the bank is using someone else's money to make more money. So they own this money for a certain period of time. Liabilities is anything that is owed to someone. So when someone deposits money into a bank, that is an asset because they can use it for loans, bonds, securities, but it is also a liability because at any moment those people or that person could come back for their money. Let's take a look at our first balance sheet. This is the Bank of Millersville. The Bank of Millersville has a 10% reserve requirement, which means all money that is deposited, 10% of that money has to stay in reserves. When looking at the assets and liabilities, the first thing you want to realize is that liabilities and assets have to be equal. Notice there is $1,000 in liabilities and there is also $1,000 in asset. So let's assume one person deposited their money into the Bank of Millersville, the deposit of $1,000. 10% of $1,000 is $100. So the bank is required to keep $100 in its reserve. That money will never be loaned out. Immediately, the bank makes a loan for $400. They buy $300 worth of bonds. What is left is the excess reserve. So this bank has the potential to make another loan for $200. The purpose of this video is to give you 5 different transactions that take place at a commercial bank. And what I want you to be able to do is think about how this transaction will impact the assets of the bank, liabilities of the bank, and the excess reserves. After each example, I will give you some time to think about the impact on assets, liability, and excess reserves. Remember, assets and liabilities must always be equal. So if assets go up, liabilities go up. Excess reserves is the money left over in a bank after the required reserves are taken out. So, our first example is John deposits $100 into the bank. Take a moment, think about what will happen to the bank's assets, liabilities, and excess reserves. Let's take a look at what happens to a bank's balance sheet after John deposits $100. The balance sheet on the left was before the deposit. The balance sheet on the right is a reflection of John depositing $100. Notice there was $1,000 in the bank before. Once John deposits that $100 into the bank, you can immediately see the liabilities will go up $100. At any time, John can come back to the bank for his $100, therefore it's a liability. The bank is required to keep $10, 10% of that $100. So you can see in the box reflects a change. You can see that the required reserve has increased by $10. You can also see that because John deposited $100, the bank now has $90 that they can now use to make more loans. So let's take a look. What happened to the assets, the liabilities, and the excess reserves? Assets went up by $100 because the bank now has $100 more in its bank to make loans. Liability also goes up $100 at any time that people can come back for their money. After taking the reserve requirement out, the bank now has $90 extra that they can loan out. So assets, liabilities, and excess reserves all increase in this example. Our second example has to do with the Federal Reserve and the buying and selling of bonds. Remember, buy bonds, big bucks. During a time of a recession, the Fed wants more money in the system, and they do this by giving banks more money. So what you see is the Fed giving money to the bank and the bank giving bonds back to the Fed. So, with this in mind, take a moment and think about what happens to the bank's assets, liability, and excess reserves when the Fed buys $100 in bonds. Buy bonds, big bucks. When looking at this example, the Fed buying $100 worth of bonds from a bank, we have to think about where that $100 has come from and what that means to the overall economy. That $100 was not in the economy before. So when the Fed takes that $100 and buys a bond from the bank now has $100 more than it had before. So excess reserves is going to increase by 100. Before they had a bond, which was worth 100, but they couldn't do anything with. Now they have $100 that they can loan out. So the Fed just increased the money supply just by buying that bond. Let's take a look at assets and liability. You can see before the bond, the bank had an excess reserves of 200. Now, when the bond is bought, you can see the bank has an excess reserves of $300. The bonds, which was $300 before the Fed bought the bond, now goes down to $200. So what you can see, your total assets do not change. Your excess reserves, your bond reserves was $500 in the first example, and now it's $500 in the second example. Except now we have 100 more in excess reserves and 100 less in bonds. If assets don't change, liabilities cannot change. If an individual needs money or a corporation needs money, they go to a bank for a loan. So, where does a bank go for a loan? Well, banks have two options. They can borrow from another bank and pay what's called the federal funds rate, or the bank can borrow from the Fed and pay what's called the discount rate. So let's look at what would happen to a bank's assets, liability, and excess reserves if a bank borrows money from the Fed. Just like individuals, banks will borrow more money from the Fed and from other banks if the interest rate is low. Banks will borrow less money if the interest rate is high. So the Fed controls how much is borrowed by the interest rate. If they want banks to borrow more, they will keep the interest rate low. If they want banks to borrow less, they will keep the interest rate high. So in this case, the Fed makes a loan to the bank. You can see before the loan, there was $1,000 in liability. Now that the bank is borrowing $100 and they owe $100 to the Fed, their liabilities will increase by 100. If liabilities increase, we know assets also have to increase. So instead of $200 in excess reserves, we now have $300 in excess reserves. This bank can now loan out 100 more than they could before, which means assets go up, liabilities go up, and excess reserves go up. Let's say the Fed wants to increase the money supply. One of the ways in which the Fed can increase the money supply is by lowering the reserve requirement. And what that means is lowering the amount that banks are required to keep in reserves. So let's think about this for a moment. If the Fed lowers reserve requirements, when John deposits $100, what's going to happen to that bank's assets, liabilities, and excess reserves? Let's take a careful look at what happens to a bank's assets, liability, and excess reserves when the Federal Reserve lowers the reserve requirement. Remember, by lowering the reserve requirement, the Federal Reserve is telling banks you don't have to keep as much money and you can make more loans. Decreasing the reserve requirement will increase loans, which will ultimately increase the money supply. So, when the required reserve was 10%, 10% of all checkable deposits was $100. The bank was required to keep and hold $100. If the Federal Reserve decreases the required reserves to 5%, now the bank is only required to keep $50, which means that they have $50 more to create loans. Now, in terms of assets and liabilities are not going to change. That $50 is leaving required and going into excess. So your total amount of assets has not changed. You're just changing one asset for another. And since your assets don't change, your liability will also not change. We already examined the impact if the Fed buys a bond from a bank, but what happens to the bank's assets, liability, and excess reserve if the Fed sells $100 worth of bonds? Remember, sell bonds, small bucks. By selling bonds, what the Fed is doing is they're taking money out of the system. So, what impact will this have on a bank's assets, liability, and excess reserves? Our last transaction is what happens to assets, liability, and excess reserves when the Fed sells bonds. Say, for instance, I am the Fed. I have a bond. I want to sell that bond. I find a bank that is willing to buy that bond. I give my bond on the Federal Reserve to the bank. The bank keeps my bond and gives me their money. The bank used to have $100, which they could loan out. Now they have a bond that's worth $100. So let's take a look at what happened to their assets and liability. Well, nothing happens to their assets. Excess reserves and bonds are both assets. So all we are doing is swapping one asset for another. Since your assets do not change, your liabilities, therefore, do not change. The bank doesn't owe any more than $1,000. So what does change? Well, the excess reserves will change. Before buying the bond, the bank had $100 in which they can make loans. Now, the bank doesn't have that $100 anymore. So excess reserves goes down.